Okay, so yeah, so it involves my father. So we're from Newfoundland, the east coast of Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador. So if anyone listening who's like, well, he doesn't sound like a Newfie, it's because I do actually sound like a Newfie. But when I did my tour guide training and whatnot, guides often learn how to project their voices differently. So, and this is now also my podcast voice and whatnot. I do actually have a very bit of an Irish lilt, which is common in the where I'm from. But anyway, so when my father was about 10 years old, so this would have been around 1951, 1952, my grandfather got a job in an area called Placentia Bay. You know, my father's from a place called Carbonear, and that's where I grew up as well. And uh, the Placentia Bay was a big area during World War II. Actually, the Americans had a base there, and so my grandfather got a job there. I can't exactly, not really sure what he was doing, and they had to rent a house. So they moved into the house, and it turned out that the previous tenant, whose name was Mrs. Barnes, had died in the home, and her funeral, her wake, everything was in the home, which was common at that time. And sometime after they moved in, not long after, because they weren't there very long, things started to get strange. They would hear noises, footsteps in the hallway at night, and things like that. Certain cases would be um, someone would walk down the the hallway at night on the second floor and stop in front of the bedroom doors and open the door slightly and then close the door again. So one time that happened, my father and his twin brother, my uncle, were in their room, and they heard the footsteps. The door opened, and they thought it was their mother, and the door closed again. So the next day at breakfast, they asked her, "It's like, Mom, why did you come and peek in on us last night?" They didn't see anyone peek in, but they just heard the door open. It was dark in the hallway and whatnot. And she's like, "I didn't do that." So that was kind of the beginning of it. And things started to escalate pretty quickly. And one of the first real big events that frightened the kids. So it was my father, his twin brother, and their younger sister. And one evening, the my grandparents went to a function of some sort. So the kids were left alone, which was common to leave a 10-year-old alone, I guess, for a few hours, and their 6-year-old sister or something. It wasn't considered unusual in those days. And so when all the kids were in the kitchen, because that's where the heat was, because there was this wood heat coming from the stove, and they were all just doing their homework, sitting at lamplight. There's no electricity, so sitting at lamplight. Newfoundland, actually, a lot of places didn't have electricity still in the 1950s, and so they're sitting at lamplight doing their homework, and the kitchen was always blocked off to keep heat in the kitchen. The kitchen always had a door that you could close. That's the way the old houses were designed, and they had the door closed to keep the heat in the kitchen. They heard rattling on the doorknob as if someone from the living room was trying to get into the kitchen. And their dog, whose name was Bud, started freaking out. One of them jumped up and kind of locked the door. And for the whole time that they were alone in the house, the rattling and banging was on that door from the living room to the kitchen. They were too afraid to go out to actually leave the house, so they stayed there. And when my grandparents arrived home, they came in through the door, which was the kitchen door. The rattling stopped, and then the kids all freaked out and they ran to their parents. And they said, "Oh, this strange rattling was happening and things like that." And so yeah, that was an experience, and all three of them experienced it, and all three of them told that to me in the same way. And then things got weird. My grandmother would wake up in the very early morning. She'd get up at like 5 or something like that to make breakfast. She'd bake bread and things like that. The lifestyle of the era, rural Newfoundland in the 1950s. And so she'd wake up, and in the morning she would start to find the the splits. I don't even know what else we'd call them. The splits are when you the kindling for making your fire in the wood stove, which was used for heat and for cooking. And so she would wake up and the splits would be thrown all across the floor. And she thought my father and his twin brother did it. So she ran upstairs and she dragged them down by the ears and she's beating them. She's like, why would you make a mess in the kitchen like that? Clean it up. They're like, we didn't do it. And of course, then she's like, why are you lying to your mother and all this kind of stuff. So that they had to clean it up. Next morning it happened again. And then my grandmother was thinking, oh, they wouldn't do it again. Surely they wouldn't do it again. So she cleaned it up. And then she waited to see if it happened the third day, and it did. And the third day, what happened, not only was the kindling thrown all across the floor, but there was soil from the crawl space brought up and tossed all across the kitchen. Mm. And then they started thinking it was weird. They thought people were breaking into the house. And so my grandfather apparently went down with his shotgun, his hunting rifle, and like stayed in the kitchen or something, and fell asleep. Woke up in the morning. There was nothing there. He was like, okay, well, they probably knew I was sleeping in the kitchen. And so he said, well, it'll be fine. Maybe it's okay now. Next morning, they came down. He didn't stay down there that night. Again, there's kindling and soil all across the floor. And there was even more so. My father described it as one time happening. It was like an inch thick, like on the kitchen table. So just soil just piled on the kitchen table, on the chairs and everything. Very, very bizarre. They couldn't explain it. So they had all that experience with the soil and things like that. And then they realized pretty quickly then that, my father and my uncle were not doing it, because they get their arses beat pretty bad for them assuming it was them the first time. So other things that started to happen, people then started to experience actually feeling and seeing things. And I can't remember how the timeline goes, but I think the first person to, and actually the only person to be touched by this alleged ghost, now they realize that there's something strange in the house, was my father. And he was sitting on the bed reading a comic book. And he even remembered which comic it was, because this memory was so ingrained in his head. It was a Johnny Thunder comic. And so he was sitting on the bed with the dog, Bud, reading the comic. And the dog wasn't on the bed, sorry. So he was in the room. My father was alone in the room, and Bud was on the floor. Bud wasn't allowed on the bed. It was just the house rules. Dog can't be on the bed. And so Bud started whimpering. And the door to the room was open. So Bud started whimpering, and he jumped on the bed. My father said, "Oh, Bud, get down. You can't, if Dad sees you, he's going to freak out. So get off the bed." So he said, "Bud, get down, get down." And so he ushered him off the bed. And then Bud kept whimpering and like walking in circles on the floor and looking at the door and trying to get away from the door. Jumped on the bed again, and then my dad's like, "Bud, get off the bed." So he just kind of ushered him off the bed again. But Bud kept freaking out. And then my father was like, what's the matter with you? Bud jumped on the bed a third time. And when my father went to usher him off the bed, something slapped my father's left hand. And it slapped him so hard, it left a large crescent moon shape in his hand. And he had that scar for ages. And he said it took a very long time to heal. And, they, did all the ointments and the things that they had in the day. It just wouldn't heal. It took a very long time. And it was very sore for a long time. So if I'm remembering the timeline right, that was the first experience someone had with direct contact. And so now they were thinking that, okay, there's something unusual in the house. And then people started to think it was the ghost of the previous owner, Mrs. Barnes. And some other things that happened, some neighbors came over, and they were neighbor kids, and they were sleeping in a room, and there was a brother and a sister, and the brother had and they were sleeping in the same bed while they were staying over, and they're in their own room. And while they were the boy that day, the older brother had just gotten a haircut. So this is the 1950s. All the boys got a crew cut. It's just the way everyone got their haircut. Long in the front and then just really tight in the back. And so the sister loved rubbing uh, the back of her brother's hair when he got a haircut. And it feels good, when you get a haircut and it's nice and tight. My daughter does, because I usually shave my head. I'm due for a shave, but my daughter likes rubbing the back of my head when it's really really short. It just feels good. And so they were asleep. Well, the brother was anyway, and the sister was behind rubbing the back of his head. And suddenly a woman yelled at her to go to sleep, an old woman's voice. And she freaked out. She started crying. And then my grandfather and everyone ran up into the room. And she said she heard an old woman yell at her to go to sleep. And just out of nowhere, she was fully awake. They hadn't experienced, those kids didn't know about the weird things that were going on in the home. And so she had no context to put any of that in her head, that the house was being the house was weird and a lot of strange things were going on in the home. So yeah, that was an experience that someone had who wasn't even part of the family, didn't live in the home. There was something else where on the third floor, which was essentially the attic, there was a young woman living there who was living there and knew Mrs. Barnes, knew the old woman who lived there previously. And so she recognized, she would have known her. As far as I recall, she wasn't experiencing anything unusual. And then one night they heard screaming coming from the attic. And so, and I should maybe explain this a little bit more. So my father, my grandparents and their three kids, they had kind of basically the first and second floor. The attic was still being rented out by this young woman, like I said, who knew Mrs. Barnes. So they heard this screaming. My grandfather ran upstairs. My grandmother ran upstairs as well. And she was huddled in her bed, like clutching her blanket. And my grandmother went to her to calm her down. She's like, "What's going on?" My grandfather was looking around the room to see if, I don't know if this, I don't know, like something got into the room, bad or something got into the room, freaked her out. It was the middle of the night. And she said she woke up and Mrs. Barnes was looking at her over the bed. And that woman would have recognized her because she knew her. She knew who Mrs. Barnes was. And then things just started to get worse and worse from there. One of the final really big things that happened was my father was in the back garden, in the back of the house, the backyard of the house, and he was Newfoundland. We say he was claving wood. He was cutting wood for wood heat. And he was cutting the wood, and he bent down to pick up a armful of wood, and he had his head down looking at it. And if you're bending down and you're looking at the ground, you can't see what's kind of above your eyes, but if anything's in front of you, you can see it. So he saw a pair of legs walking by him, and he thought it was the next door neighbor going to see maybe like his mom, my grandmother. And he said hello to her, but he didn't look up at her because she wasn't very friendly. My father didn't like that woman, the neighbor. She was really unfriendly. She hated children, this kind of thing. But it was all kind of considered that the kids should always be polite in those days. You should always say hello and things like that. So my father was always kind of rebellious, and he was like, "Hi," but didn't look up at her, didn't make eye contact with her. And there was no reply, which wasn't unusual because that woman wasn't friendly. My father heard the screen door to the house, which was again, like the back door, was the kitchen. So you open the screen door, you walk directly into the kitchen. He heard the door open and close. So it's just typical, screen doors squeak a little bit, and when they have that really unique bang, the dong dong, when they close, kind of bounces off the frame, and before it comes to a full shut. So he heard that sound. So then he picked up the armful of wood, and he had to bring it into his mother because she was baking, she was cooking or something, so she needed more heat in the stove. And he went in, opened the door, screen door, slammed with the same sound, and he said, here's your wood. And then he looked around and he said, "Where's the neighbor? The neighbor?" And my grandmother was like, "No, what are you talking about?" She said, "I just saw her come into the house." And my grandmother said, "No one came in. I've been here all morning. No one came into the house." So she was in the kitchen for at least for quite some time before my father went into the house. And the timing would have worked out. If anyone did walk into the house, my grandmother would have been in the kitchen and would have seen somebody. Excuse me. So but no, she was like, no one came into the house. So that was one of the very last things to happen, and they were kind of like, okay. Grandfather's like, all right, let's see if we can go to a new place. So they left, and then that was pretty much the end of their time staying there. When they left, though, remembering that they were renting the house, they just kind of left and got all their belongings, and they went somewhere else. I'm not sure where they went. My father has since passed away, but I can probably ask my uncle, he's still alive, to clarify. I don't remember where they went, but they went somewhere, and they were still in the same town, which was called, I said it was Placentia Bay, but the town was called Dunnville. And so they went off somewhere because they had to get away from the house. And my grandfather realized that he left the key to the house in the house. And as the tenant, it was his responsibility to do all that, get all that prepared, and then give it to the owner. And he was like, oh, God, I got to go back and go back into the house to get the key. And he didn't want to go back. So leading up to all this, whenever my grandfather would go out, my father and his twin would always ask him, Dad, can we come? We want to go with you. Can we come? And he was like, no, you're staying here. Go do your homework. Go read a book, go play somewhere, get out of my hair. And every single time he'd go out anywhere, it's like, no, Dad, can we come with you? He's like, no, I'm busy. Stay home. This one time when my grandfather, they had left the house, realized the key was in the home. He's like, oh, I got to go get the key. And he told the family, he's like, I got to go out. I got to go somewhere. And my father and my uncle were like, Dad, can we come with you? And he's like, yeah, come on. He didn't want to go to the house by himself. So they went with them. They went with them down just to get the key. It was in the kitchen, I think. So they had to go through that door where it was really the kitchen, like really where a lot of the activity was happening. It's like the soil, the kindling being tossed across the floor, that rattling door that one night. The father saw the legs of, they assume was the ghost of Mrs. Barron's, entering the house in through the kitchen door. They had to go, that's where the key was. They had to go and grab the key. And my father told me, he's like, he just went in, my pop went in, got the key, and just left. He didn't stay. And he made them wait outside. He's like, just hold the door open. And he went and he got the key, he knew where it was, just on the table or something, got it, and they left. And they never went back. That's it. They moved back to Carbonear not long after that, where my father had another ghost experience too, actually.
Oh,
Yeah. But yeah. After that. So that's the story of the haunted house that my father lived in Dunnville, Newfoundland in the 1950s, early 1950s.